Happy Friday. What's good? All praise. I've been sitting still searching for God. It's gone great. Easy street is peace. The hands of relief like all state. How can I lose? It's proven, of course. I'm on pace. We all one energy, cross states. Even odds, Venus, Mars, we connected it all on raw faith. Keep the crowd jumping like ball fakes. Haters hate with the long face. We taking up our space. Jesus sequel, and these are the lost tapes. Yeah. Bars. What's good? Today we're gonna be talking about the God of the Gaps. The God of the Gaps. God of the Gaps is a phrase that I first heard several years ago when I was really fascinated with the debate between atheism and religion. And there was a group of guys called the Four Horsemen right now. I think was it Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens. They were the atheists and they would go around debating religious people. And the phrase God of the Gaps was a reference to not just religious people, but also atheists or science-oriented people. But the God of the Gaps was a reference to the idea that God exists in the spaces that don't have scientific language. And to me, at the time, and I think the atheists used it as a point in their favor because it demonstrates the power of science and how God recedes into spaces that don't have scientific language. And there's something powerful about that. Yeah, the idea that God recedes into the spaces that don't have scientific language. The scientists have stories. The biologists have stories. They can tell you without God. They can talk as atheists. They can talk about material experience. They can give you a story about the human biology and the relationship between systems in the human body, and that this is a story, and that story is sufficient. And of course, there's always that deeper story about the consciousness underneath it all. Again, talk about these stories. Like we talk about so many times, the human vision is just a marvel. The cones and the rods and how they work involuntarily and give your brain the information. What the brain does, actually. The number of senses you have. We were taught 5, but there's something more like 22 plus senses, including something called proprioception, which has to do with our balance and spatial awareness, and interoception, which has to do with a bunch of internal sensors in our body that give us awareness of heat and hunger and thirst, and that these things happen involuntarily. So there's that involuntary nature of it and the consciousness of it, and that all these systems are at play for us without our effort. To me, that's evidence for God. But if you have enough language, and if you study these systems closely, you can develop the language to talk about them entirely without God. And on one level, that's a good thing. And that's why science is helpful, giving us language, giving us stories about relationships, giving us a logic. But the phrase God of the Gaps is a bit incorrect, right? Because the truth is that God is not only in the gaps, God is in those stories that you also have the ability to talk about. That deep story about human vision and how it works, or the cardiovascular system, or how we breathe and how it works independently. That story about the systems does not negate God. In fact, God has to be evident in those things, because the whole thing, for it to work, and the whole point of it, the fact that your consciousness, your awareness depends on it, your experience, your entire experience depends on that involuntary system, still points to it can't be explained in its totality. The atheist, materialist, scientist wants to tell a story about the relationship between systems. And then they might say, all right, so yeah, if we get into consciousness and you get into all these, underlying truths under those systems, They might say, well, this is information or knowledge not yet known. There's a reticence or a you don't want to apply God in that space. And I kind of get that. There was a time when I thought that this was something that Christians do or that the religious people do to fill spaces unknown, and they fill it with their God. Um, and so again, when I looked at those four gentlemen I mentioned earlier, and a lot of that atheist movement that developed on YouTube and these debates and stuff, when I really look further at it, I'm looking at stories. I'm looking at the atheist is negating or rejecting a Christian story. The atheist is rejecting a religious story. They aren't necessarily looking at what is. Sam Harris has made a career out of being able to rebut and reject a religious story. But even he arrives at some sort of mysticism when he's serious. He's very terrible, by the way. Um, really misses the mark with his moral pronouncements, as it relates to like what the moment actually needs. But anyway, it's stories. It's stories. I want to say, like, God is a word. God is merely a word. It is a three-letter word that points to a phenomenon much more complex than the word. And I understand why people pause and don't want to apply God there, because the word has been used and defined poorly and taken, and everyone claims to have some connection to God, even while they're committing the most obvious atrocities, right? So, and even that, when people are committing atrocities, we might say, well, that's evidence that there's no God. Why would God allow this? Why would God allow people to take his name and usurp his name and appropriate his name while committing atrocities? Why would he allow that? So the whole thing is that too that relies on an assumption about God. This whole thing about allow. We're still dealing with an anthropomorphic sort of notion of this separate God who is watching and allowing this and that, and he prefers that, but he hates that. And a notion of God and perfection, which oftentimes we don't understand how pain and suffering is a part of. Pain and suffering, confusion, violence doesn't negate God and the perfection of the whole system. Our bodily systems go through challenges. They grow. Our musculature grows through pain, maybe through suffering in a context, in a condition of some safety. Your muscles, you can intentionally injure your muscle. You can intentionally not injure. Injure implies something else, but you can rip your muscles and you can let them heal and have them grow. These are phenomena. These are things about the human biology that are, even as you can describe them, they're fantastic. Some of it is miraculous. Some of it, it certainly escapes the typical biology language. But it all depends on the story you have. It all depends on your perception. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about stories and perception. I've talked about this in multiple episodes. We've spent some time talking about linguistics and how words lead, identity can lead us. I've said that words are spells. What do I mean by that? I'm claiming that there's a mysticism going on. I'm claiming that there's something magical happening. Oh, Billy, you're out of control. Come on. This is illogical stuff. This isn't, science has mapped it out. There's nothing magical going on. I don't care what word you use. I don't care if you call it God. I don't care if you call it magic or mysticism or spiritual. I really don't care. Those are all words. And the words you use will tell you about you. The words that you're comfortable with only tell you about you. They don't actually tell you about the thing in reality. So, but if you look closely at what words are and what stories are and what labels and categories are and what they do, there's something here. It's not, you don't have to call it God, but there's a power here. There's something intangible that can move us and can motivate us and can govern our assumptions and can set the limitations for our awareness and set the limitations of our perception and the direction and the focus of our perception. What is that? That doesn't fit neatly in our biology understanding. Some people will say, okay, you have someone with, okay, I'm a psychology major. I can describe that. Well, um, the human brain strives to understand and the identity kind of is a shorthand that gives us a sense of reality so that we can move. Okay. Yeah. And so like sometimes we look out and we say, okay, people are abusive and there's violence and how does these things happen? And so there's no God. But if you look at the mundane, look at the simple things, look at the words that we use when we speak to ourselves, look at the words we use when we speak to each other and the words we use when we speak to ourselves. And the assumptions we make about the world. Look how interestingly, even though we typically like to believe that there's an objective truth, there's something that we can all access that is reality, that actually in our minds individually as localized expressions, localized sovereign expressions of consciousness, right? That we can apply different words and we can assume different things and see completely different things. Okay, I got a couple examples. A friend of mine, oh my God, it's at 12 minutes already. I love this. Wow. Let me try to run through this. A friend of mine just is leaving town and she had a bunch of furniture and she wanted to give us her furniture. She's been over to our place several times and she's a good friend. And she described our place as minimalist. She was like, good, you guys have a kind of a minimalist style. I'm gonna, hope you guys like some of the stuff here. And she's well traveled and she has a lot of bold pieces and furniture and art. And I was like, minimalist. That word didn't apply to me. That's not how I viewed myself or viewed the home that we're in. When I think minimalist, I think white walls and like very few pieces. We got some artwork. We got stuff going on. The walls are multiple colors. Every room has a different color. We did that a couple years ago. But yeah, when I look at it, so we got like 9 pieces from her couch and a dresser and some really great stuff. And they're all like awesome. They kind of reshape the whole place. And the word minimalist was one that it stuck out to me and I remembered it and it didn't fit for me in my mind. But I see how from her vantage point, maybe minimalist works. Like we still don't have a ton of furniture, but we certainly have more than we did before. And maybe minimalist worked. I get it. What is that? What is that about the nature of perception, the relative nature of perception on something like minimalist? Something like hot and cold and wet and dry. Adjectives, ways that we perceive the world, labels we might apply to something. That actually it's relative, that something is hot in a context. It's hot for what it is. A stove is hot when it's hot as compared to when it's not hot. But that version of hot means nothing as compared to the sun, let's say. Okay, what does it mean that my friend, a friend that I had for years from New York when I was a kid, we've known each other for 20 plus years, Jewish friend of mine, that our friendship had to dissolve, that when we got into a position to talk about the genocide in Gaza, that he stopped me and asked me to only talk about pleasantries. He said that he understood that there's a lot of violence. He understood that there's a lot of suffering, but he didn't want to talk about it. And he said that our friendship needs to get on a pause, actually. Why is it that he told me, as I asked him why, and we started to talk a little bit, I tried to push to talk about reality together, tried to see if we could do it. He said, I stand with the Jewish people. And I had to ask him what that means. I personally know dozens of Jewish people who um, oppose the genocide and see what's going on and see the aggressive nature of Israel and the international law abuses and the violence. Um, how is it that he has more, or that he felt common cause with the settlers in the West Bank, for instance, because of a word, because of an identity word? This is a person who grew up in Brooklyn, New York. This is a person who genealogy goes more to the Ukraine, goes to Europe, um, and we can't agree on language together. We can't see the world together because of this word, this identity that he has. So much so that he shut the conversation down. He said, we can't communicate that, and our friendship is on the rocks and needs to take a hold. And obviously, we keep it moving. What is that? What is that? We want to understand why there's so much violence in the world. Let's talk about the simple things. Much simpler than international global violence. What is this about the difference between our perceptions and the language and the stories that we tell about reality? Why is it that I read about Samuel Cartwright, and I've written about Samuel Cartwright on my website. He's a historical figure in the United States, a prominent journalist who in the 1850s invented the word drapetomania. Drapetomania was a word that it was defined as, when you see an African enslaved person, an enslaved human, and you see them try to escape, um, it speaks to they're mentally ill. It's not. It was a way. It was a word that, as he was an advocate for slavery, and he used his status as a journalist and as a doctor to perpetuate chattel slavery in the United States. It was a word that robbed people from being able to see the moment, to see a human doing a natural and obvious and basic thing that most humans would do, to get up and try to escape their condition of enslavement. This word, with his clout, his status, it was a word that millions of white American Southerners would adopt to understand uh, and to defend enslavement, right? It was a way to, again, this is not a human. It dehumanized the enslaved person. It put their obvious behavior in a context that made it hard to see. It pathologized basic, obvious human behavior. Why, in one of his papers, as he wrote about drapetomania, and he wrote, because his whole thing was he wanted to help white slave owners maximize their income from the slave system. He came up with really clever systems. He's no different than like a Ben Shapiro in today's context, or a anybody on Fox News. He was a journalist of that type. He used the word spellbound. He said there's a specific way you can handle the slave. You have to be aggressive and violent if they ever step out of place, but also treat them with a certain modicum of care and care for their basic necessities, and the slave will be spellbound. Why did he use that word? You think it was just nothing? It's just nothing? Just an accident that he used the word spellbound? Or did this journalist, doctor, use his language with intention, and he was well aware of something about the nature of words and the nature of this reality and perception, and he was playing in that? Not only for the white slave-owning reader that he was catering to, but for the whole condition. That if we can agree on this language together, that this condition of chattel slavery can perpetuate itself, as long as the powerful people maintain it, and we can continue to call ourselves decent people and moral people and Christians. What is that? What is that difference in perception? How is it possible that we can all look at a human, and that I can come up with something to dehumanize them, and that other people can agree, and that we can create systems and laws and really lock in a perversion of reality together. What is that? You might say that this is evidence of God's absence. I can see why you might say that. I say that deeper than looking at the evil that's occurring there are systems of, like, underneath. We say this is evil and that's God's absence, but actually underneath it, there's linguistics, there's identity, there's perception, there's localized psychology, there's groupthink, there's power and fear, there's perception. There's the fact that we don't engage with the truth of the thing. We don't engage with the truth of a person, a very complex phenomenon like another human being. We engage with the language, we engage with the labels we assign to them. How is it possible that millions of young boys can be trained to hate women because they don't know anything about women? They're trained to be numb in terms of their effort and their curiosity towards women and men and humans, that they can just simply rely on um, stories about the separation, and then begin to hate and begin to fantasize about rape and begin to plot. Instead of thinking about life as an engagement with women, they're thinking about life as, like, as women as, like, prey, merely because they agreed on language together. What is that? What happens when that same kid, after doing that for years maybe and failing, starts to actually engage with a woman meaningfully, opens himself up to new language, new awareness, engages with a woman who is also able to be vulnerable and share, and that he sees that there's actually a lot of the separations he created were false, and that the world is much more complex than he thought, that evolution is possible, that evolution of thought is possible. What is that? It doesn't have to be God, but it's certainly, it's a powerful, mystical, dare I say, spiritual condition. It's not the basic material, the sort of material approach about ourselves, that we are just bones and skin. And there's something about the psyche and about linguistics and identity. How do millions of people watch Fox News' racism and assume it to be true? I said the other case about this woman. She was watching this YouTube video, a woman who killed her husband, and tricked the police for over a year. What is that about words and perception, that when a truth occurred, the husband is in the yard, murdered, the police come over, and she gives a performance and she gives language, and she asserts that she's so sad and she doesn't know what happened. And then these experts, these, like, detectives, go about their lives and they try to figure it out elsewhere. They've been tricked. How does that happen? If reality is present to us and it's right here, what how does someone marshal words so easily to get people off the trail, to spin people in another direction? How is that possible? What's happening? This is a condition that's happening every day. It's a bit less, we might consider it. I mean, I'm talking about murder in that case, but I mean, just generally, the way we profoundly talk about things and talk about ourselves, the left and the right. What is the right when you're talking about fascist, racist people who insist that certain people don't belong in the democratic process? We call that right. When you call it right, you normalize it. When you call it right, you set up a framework that it's merely an alternate to this other thing called left. Well, if it's merely an alternate to this other thing called left, well, then great. The right gets, okay, it makes sense. The right should have their own groups of media circles and the right, maybe the right should be, invited to the White House as well, because it's just the right. Well, maybe it's not just the right. Maybe you've given it a label to normalize it, and you've actually ruined everything. Now the whole framework has been warped with something that doesn't belong. And you need to tell accurate stories to understand that. What is it that people look out in the world and they see their assumptions? They don't see me. They don't see you. You're too complex. You're too full. You're a five-dimensional being. You exist in time and space. You evolve over time. And then deeper than that, you are connected to the entire totality of things. And that at every moment, which is the only thing that exists, that is now, that you could be something else tomorrow. And that like that you can jump to pursue your biggest and greatest potential and your greatest fantasy, and that would be a complete diversion from what the prior and all these expectations that people had of you from before, that you can betray all that and be entirely something different in this moment, but that no one would even be able to understand that because the stories they had about you was something else. That people see their assumptions. Hmm. Um, they see their stories. They're looking for. They see what they're looking for. That's powerful. And if it's not God, if you don't like the word God for that, um, that's fine. But note that this applies to you too. You see what you're looking for. You're the thing. You're part of the whole thing. You're one with the whole thing. I'm gonna end just wow, time has flown. Wow, wow, wow. I'm just gonna end with this. Look, I think some powerful things happen when you start with some core truths, whether you fully believe this, whether you fully understand it or not, whether it's been fully explained to you. If you start with some core truths about perception and then start to see the world through that, a lot of things change. The core truth is, number one, it's all one thing. It's all one thing. It doesn't mean that it's only one thing. The separations are so well ingrained in us. We are well aware of the separations between us as Americans and Mexicans and Canadians. We play in that space all the time. I'm well aware of the separation of me and a white person and the ways that we're separate. The stories, there's so many stories. I'm well aware of the separation between me and women. I know how we're different, but to include the fact that it's also one thing. Oh my God, understand the fuller story about this condition. The paradoxical, fuller story about this condition, that it's all one thing. So that's the first truth. The second truth is that the symbols we have, the stories and the symbols we have, fall short. The stories are a compilation of sentences. The sentences are a compilation of words, and the words are labels and categories that humans have created, splitting up the world, carving up the world, doing so that we can tell a complex story, and that there's value in that. But be careful, because you can get so familiar. You can think that, particularly if you are well studied on something, let's say, and you have all this language, now you commit yourself to the idea that you know, when in fact you have stories. You have stories about the relationship of systems. You have not, there's still the unknown. There is still the mystical. There is still God. There is still the consciousness. The fact that you can observe it in the first place. The fact that you are here observing this in the first place, and that it sustains you somehow. That hasn't been answered. So God is not only in the gaps, He's also in the things you've actually told stories about. You haven't pushed God towards the gaps. God is in all of the things. You simply don't have the knowledge, and we haven't developed the language and the awareness, perhaps, about these things that we call gaps. It might be the case that they can't be those things, those bridges. It's always important to strive and keep aiming to give language and keep aiming to understand better, but that it is, and God is, and I am. And what happens when you understand that? What happens when you have that higher understanding? I'm gonna wrap it up there, yo. Wow, 30 minutes. Listen, peace. Check out the rest of my YouTube. Thanks for joining me on these conversations. Yeah. Um, I see the God in you. And subscribe to my YouTube. Check out my website, billybutton.com. I'll see you tomorrow.